The Senate recently passed the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. If enacted, the reform would raise the asset threshold for designation as a systemically important financial institution, relaxing regulatory requirements for some banks immediately and for others after 18 months. The bill would also ease stress testing requirements, exempt smaller institutions from the VOCA rule, and ease supplementary leverage ratio requirements for custodial institutions. The Senate's passage of the bill was met with praise from many industry groups, indicating their preference for the new proposed rules over the existing ones. But how might bankers feel once the new rules are actually implemented? A recent GCFP study might provide some insights. Shortly after the 2016 election, we surveyed about 50 senior officials from U.S. financial institutions on their perceptions of the current regulatory regime. We asked them about the costliness and effectiveness of various Dodd-Frank regulations, and the responses could have some hints about attitudes to come if the reform bill becomes law. How? Well, some institutions are already operating under lighter requirements, so we can compare their responses with those of banks who may soon be joining them. Applicability for many types of regulation has to do with asset size, so it's useful to have a sense of how many institutions fall into each bucket. So let's see how these groups might be affected by the proposed Dodd-Frank rollback. Take, for instance, capital requirements, or rules governing how much capital a financial institution must retain based on the amount and riskiness of its assets. As we mentioned before, the SIFI designation threshold would be raised from $50 to $250 billion under the proposed reform, and one implication of that change would be reduced capital requirements for some banks. More specifically, the group of institutions with between $50 and $250 billion in total assets will see the requirements eased. But how might that affect the costliness or effectiveness of capital requirements? Well, most executives from banks with tighter capital requirements under the current regime reported high or very high compliance costs. Respondents from banks with lighter capital requirements were more varied in their perceptions of costliness. With respect to effectiveness, respondents from banks with tighter capital requirements generally skewed a bit higher than those from banks with lighter requirements. Next, let's take a look at living will regulation, a requirement that certain banks make a plan for the orderly dissolution of their business if they, well, fail. Once again, the banks subject to changing rules are in that $50 to $250 billion asset range. Survey results on the burden of living wills shows a pretty clear divide between respondents from banks subject to living will requirements and those who are not. It is interesting that some respondents reported some costs related to living will requirements, even though their institutions are not formally subject to the regulation. This may suggest that newly exempted institutions may not see their compliance costs go down to zero on this front. Looking at ratings of effectiveness, we see a similar pattern, though nobody seemed particularly enthusiastic about living wills. The last type of regulation we'll talk about is stress testing, which is the practice of analyzing hypothetical portfolio performance under adverse economic scenarios. Under current law, most bank holding companies are required to both perform their own company-run stress tests and undergo supervisory stress tests conducted by the Federal Reserve. First, we'll talk about changes to company-run stress testing. Under current law, bank holding companies with at least $10 billion in assets have to conduct semi-annual stress tests under at least 3 scenarios: baseline, adverse, and severely adverse. Under the proposed reform, all bank holding companies with less than $250 billion in assets would be exempt from company-run stress testing. Bank holding companies with more than $250 billion would be required to do so only periodically, and the number of required scenarios would be reduced to 2, baseline and severely adverse. Now let's turn to supervisory stress tests. Under current law, bank holding companies with at least $50 billion in assets are subject to annual supervisory stress tests under at least 3 scenarios: baseline, adverse, and severely adverse. Under the new proposal, bank holding companies with less than $100 billion in assets would be exempt from supervisory stress testing. Bank holding companies with between $100 and $250 billion would undergo the Fed's stress test periodically, while those with more than $250 billion in assets would remain on an annual schedule. For both groups, the number of required scenarios would be reduced from 3 to 2, once again dropping the adverse scenario. Turning back to our survey results, we see that perceptions of the costliness of stress testing are relatively consistent across respondents from various sizes of institutions. This is particularly true of institutions with less than $250 billion in assets, which happen to be the ones with the greatest regulatory relief potentially ahead. Between the proposed changes to company-run and supervisory stress testing, institutions with between $50 and $250 billion in assets could see the most change in their requirements. Notably, more than 50% of respondents from such institutions indicated that stress testing is highly effective in making their institutions safer. Should this reform bill ultimately be enacted, it'll be interesting to see if any institutions continue heightened stress testing practices on a voluntary basis. Looking ahead, the legislative path forward is unclear. While S.2155 has been passed by the Senate, it still must be approved by the House, which has already passed several of its own bills in the current Congress and may not be prepared to swallow the Senate bill as is. In any case, it seems likely that banks will get some relief from these requirements that they regard as costly. Though as the pendulum continues to swing back toward deregulation, perhaps some institutions will continue the risk management practices they perceive as effective on a voluntary basis.